Recreational marijuana is legal in California, but what does that really mean? A look at the patchwork of regulations across the state and a push in Congress for changes in federal law. San Diego Union-Tribune has a new owner. Could he be the hero that saves newspapers? And a look at the biggest stories on the KPBS Health Beat, and a longtime reporter says goodbye. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are reporter Brooke Staggs of the Orange County Register, reporter Jane Hindman of KPBS News, reporter John Wilkins of the San Diego Union-Tribune, and KPBS health reporter Kenny Goldberg. Well, the decades-long battle to legalize marijuana continues, and cannabis sure seems to be winning. In 2016, Californians with 57% of the vote approved recreational use. And on January 1st this year, licensed pot shops opened in certain places, allowing regulated sale of the drug. But not everywhere, not by a long shot. So, Brooke, your newspaper and others in the Southern California news group looked at the Crazy Quilt, as you called them, of marijuana policies across the state. Why did you feel that study was needed?
So when we voted to legalize marijuana, we also voted to let cities make up their own rules for how it would operate. So whether businesses got to open in their boundaries, how many, what those would look like, and then also some personal rules as well, whether people get to grow cannabis outside or inside in their cities. And so when the law passed, I realized pretty quickly in talking to friends and reading online comments, a lot of people just kind of thought it was a free-for-all, that, you know, now it's legal. And we knew that wasn't the case, but there was no one tracking this to see what cities were actually passing and how many places it was legal and not. So we wanted that information for people to know the rules in their own town and for us to be able to report on it.
All right, so overall, which cities, counties, I mean, of all the jurisdictions you looked at, what percentage actually have businesses within their borders now?
So it's fewer than 30% allow at least one type of business. And then
so visitors come in, they think, oh, I'm in California, I can wander into 7-Eleven and buy pot.
Not even close, yeah, and that 30% includes businesses that the public really doesn't see, like testing and manufacturing. So when you look at recreational shops, the thing most people are thinking of, it's fewer than 1 in 7 cities in California that allow.
And again, as you said, it's up to them to decide whether and what. And San Diego is one of the places, and we've talked about that on this show. Now, you looked at the voting records for cities and counties on Prop 64, compared that to the various jurisdictions. What did you find? Did they match up?
Yeah, we did this cool interactive graphic where you can see, you know, where it's out of line on both ends. So Imperial County is an example where most of their residents voted against Prop 64. It actually failed on a local level, but the county has approved some of the most liberal policies that they can under state law. And then you have other places that, you know, are the opposite, where even though residents approved it, they don't allow any businesses. They have really strict rules for growing at home. So there's a lot of places where it's out of line. And
you have a 100-point scale, kind of a point scale on how friendly or not friendly to pot rules they are?
Yeah, we wanted a way to be able to compare. And so 0 means you allow no businesses, you make people get permits if they want to grow indoors at home. And then up to 100 points would be you allow all businesses and that kind of thing. And so we're seeing that the vast majority of cities are below 2 points on our scale at this point.
Really? And yeah. What are some that are pretty liberal in this regard, if that's
LA definitely is. Palm Springs, San Francisco, Oakland, those are ones that have scored above 96 on the scale.
And I should note there was a story in the LA Times today talking about Hollywood opening Amsterdam-type lounges, and I think Oakland, San Francisco are looking at that, even Coachella out in that county.
Right, yeah, these are some of kind of the furthest place that cities can take it. To get 100 on our scale, they would need to do some of these extra things. So West Hollywood, Palm Springs, they're going to allow consumption lounges where people can consume on the property.
And San Diego, our audience is interested. Where do we rank on your 100-point scale?
So you guys just missed the leaderboard. It's 95.9, only because the city doesn't let residents grow outdoors at home. So that's the only restriction. I mean, all businesses are allowed.
And what are some of the main reasons you hear for these various jurisdictions to not allow pot businesses?
It's usually safety. You know, folks are worried about the fact that because it's still federally illegal, it's hard to get good research on, you know, how it affects driving under the influence and teen use rates. The numbers that we do have so far are encouraging, that the impact is not so severe at all. But because of the federal illegality, some folks also are worried about, are we violating federal law if we approve this? So there's a big conflict there.
John?
So I'm hoping you can refresh my memory. Why did they write the the law that way when it was on the ballot so that the cities could have that much say?
So I think, this has been tried to be passed in California before, and like the California League of Cities, for example, it was really opposed to previous measures that did not give cities that local control. And so that was in there this time, and they didn't face that same kind of pushback from some of those groups that they faced in the past because they let them locally regulate.
Kenny?
What about the tax revenue? Is that a set amount, or can cities and counties set their own level?
So there's a flat 15% tax at the state level, and then cities definitely can set their own as well. And this was one interesting thing we found in doing the database. I would have assumed before doing it that every city that allows businesses has an additional tax in place, right? Because they want to make the additional money off of it. But what we found is that less than half of the cities that have approved allowing businesses have local tax measures in place. And there will definitely be more on the ballot in June and November, so we will see more. But we've also heard some cities that are going the development fee route instead, and it's kind of questionable. Is that an end run around Prop 218? It's, not putting it on the ballot before voters. But cities are making money off of it, but it's just not always in the form of a tax necessarily.
Now, I should note and said at the outset that it's still illegal federally, but there's some change on that. President Trump this week signaled his support for the industry, but his Attorney General Jeff Sessions, let's go back to the drug war in the 80s and earlier, and yet the House or the Senate Minority Leader Schumer today, Chuck Schumer of New York, said he's introducing a bill to deschedule marijuana, which would allow all sorts of research and what we're going to talk about with Jade in a second.
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster, right? So Trump on the campaign trail said essentially what he reinforced last Friday, that I'm going to support state rights when it comes to marijuana, but he's been essentially silent on it ever since. And it's been up to Jeff Sessions to kind of be the voice for the Trump administration. And he is very anti-marijuana, both in his speeches and his actions. He removed some Obama-era protections for state marijuana rights.
Not celebrating 420 today,
I don't think so, yeah. So it caught everyone a bit by surprise last Friday. This senator out of Colorado had been blocking Department of Justice nominations until he got something from the Trump administration to say, we're going to let states carry out their programs. He's from Colorado, the first state that legalized. And so he said on a phone call, on Friday that he got that confirmation from Trump. And so now we're just waiting to see what legislation Senator comes up with and, what that'll look like and if it'll actually get passed. Right?
All right, Jade, we want to shift gears now. You focused on medical marijuana for a recent story, and you talked to a UC San Diego researcher about why more research is needed. What did he have to say?
Well, so in his research, he's found that there's a therapeutic window by which marijuana is effective at treating chronic pain. So too little of it and it does absolutely no good. Too much of it and it can actually increase pain. But if dosed just right and titrated slowly, he said that it is effective at treating pain. He's found it to be helpful for about, 80% of his patients.
All right, we have a bite there, a soundbite from that interview with Dr. Wallace, and characterizes the pain-relieving properties of it.
The bottom line is I prefer to visit medical cannabis before we resort to an opioid. I think cannabis is much more conservative. I think it's lower risk. There's never been a reported death from medical cannabis or cannabis. Look at all the deaths annually from opioid use. And right now we've got barriers, as I alluded to a moment ago, to research on marijuana at the federal level.
Exactly. Since it's still a controlled substance, Schedule I drug, right along with bath salts and ecstasy and things like that.
Heroin.
Exactly. It's been difficult for researchers to get the supply that they need to have access to it, to research it. Right now, all of their marijuana comes from the NIH, which is grown in a facility in Mississippi somewhere. And so that's just not an example of what's out there in the real world they're finding. And so they're just having a difficult time finding all of the varieties of marijuana to actually research, study, and get to a point where they can dose it and prescribe it.
And Jade, you also in your story talked to a local man severely injured in the 2003 Cedar wildfire here, Rudy Reyes, well-known San Diego activist. Let's hear what he says about his use.
75% of my outside skin is now missing that nerve that tells me pain. So in order to have any sensation, anything like that, it's always itchy. It's always crawly. It's always, and I could itch to the point of bloody, it won't make any difference. I smoke a little marijuana or ingest a little marijuana because there's different ways to ingest it now, and that goes away.
And so, aside for the anecdotes, you were talking about the research. We don't really know that much about the effectiveness as a painkiller, right?
Exactly. I mean, and again, that's because they're just not able to research it thoroughly. Obviously, for Rudy, it's worked wonders in his life. He's been able to come off of the opioids and use marijuana in its place. But again, you've got to be able to research all of the varieties out there in order to prescribe it.
And doses and all sorts of questions.
Exactly, and that's the big question.
And we were talking earlier, there's a bipartisan bill was introduced this week to do a massive study on this involving the VA. Tell us about that.
Right. So they're trying to push something through so that the VA can actually do the research on this marijuana. They're wanting to do a 5-year study and have researchers submit data on this every year for 5 years. It's something that the VA is behind. I spoke with the VA here in San Diego, and they said there's a big demand from veterans here in this area to have that study pushed through.
And of course, the national push to cut down on the opioid deaths and the abuse there. So lots of stuff to talk about as we move forward on this issue. We are going to move on now, but it's a fascinating issue and will continue to be so. Well, the story about newspapers is hardly news. The internet wrecked the revenue model. Staffs have been decimated. Some papers have folded. Political hacks decry critical stories from mainstream newspapers as, quote, fake news. Democracy itself is imperiled with so few watchdogs on the beat. What's happened in the past dozen years at the San Diego Union-Tribune reflects all of this. Same for the Los Angeles Times. Now comes a hero to save the day. At least that's what everybody hopes. So John, tell us about it. Who's this hero coming in to save the UT and the LA Times and maybe the entire industry?
Well, yeah, that's a lot of hopeful thinking.
That's a lot of hope, yeah.
His name's Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong. He is a billionaire biotech entrepreneur, a physician turned businessman. He made his money with 2 drug companies, sold them, and now he wants to get into the newspaper game.
And he had been he had been a partial owner or a stockholder, that is.
Yeah, he was I think the second largest individual stockholder for Tronc, the former Tribune company, which owned the Times and the Union-Tribune and about a half dozen other newspapers around the country.
All right, and you profiled him in the paper and then did a follow-up story. He was in town this week to talk to staff members at the UT. Set the scene for us. What happened there?
So he came to the newsroom on Monday and spent about 90 minutes with the staff answering questions and sort of laying out his vision for newspapers. He received a very enthusiastic reception from the staff. We've seen a lot of change. I've been there 30 years, and we've had 5 owners in the last 10 years. So in some ways, it's, here comes another one, but he seems to be a different animal. So.
Kenny?
How does who owns the paper influence what you do?
Well, it depends on the owner. And I've had some who were very hands-off, and then we had ownership under Mr. Manchester, which was a little more hands-on in the newsroom. So it sort of depends. The new prospective owner, and I have to say, the deal has not yet closed, so he's not yet officially the owner, but everything seems to be pointing in that direction. He has promised to be more of a hands-off owner. He's not seeing himself as a publisher initially, just as the owner. And he's been very adamant in his statements that he will not interfere in the newsroom, even when it comes to us writing about his companies.
Right, because he's been in the news before. There were some negative stories that you've mentioned. I won't go into all the details now, but in your story you had talked about that and his reaction to it. And
yeah, there have been some ethical questions raised about some of the things that have gone on in his companies. He denies any impropriety, but his companies, he's a very much an ambitious guy. He's in the news a lot, especially in the biotech and medical worlds. He's set out a very ambitious goal to try to cure cancer, and he's spending a lot of money on that project, and so he gets watched pretty closely in those worlds, and he makes news. So.
And he got some applause in that meeting here in San Diego the other day, and I did want to ask about that because I think it was about his philosophy regarding news and the place and importance of local newspapers.
Yeah, so he grew up in apartheid South Africa. He's a son of Chinese immigrants, and he is very well versed in the role that newspapers can play in a society to try to, as he says it, speak truth to power. He saw it in the newspapers that challenged the apartheid government in South Africa. So he comes from a position of somebody who has a very fond memory of how newspapers work, and he believes very strongly in the role that they play in a successfully functioning democracy.
And that brought some applause at one point. Huh?
It did, and his promise to bring stability to the newsroom also was met with a lot of applause.
And you had a one-on-one interview with him up in Los Angeles recently. How did he strike you personally when you sat on?
He's a very engaging guy. He's very warm. He's very enthusiastic about trying to take over the newspapers, and so it was very interesting to speak with him. We shared a little bit of a common interest in basketball as well. As you may know, he has a small ownership share in the Lakers.
The LA Lakers,
longtime
right.
Lakers owners, they would remember him as the guy who has a courtside seat right next to the bench, and he would always be the one who would hug Kobe Bryant game time. So he has a full court basketball court indoors at his own house in Brentwood, and as talked about building one at the new plant he wants to build for the LA Times up in El Segundo.
Okay. Now, I did want to shift it a little bit to Brooke, your paper, the Orange County Register. It's among many owned by Digital First Media. Papers in that chain, including yours, and notably the Denver newspaper, push back with stories urging Digital First to sell out. They were cutting staff so aggressively, and they were you folks are suggesting a nonprofit approach, kind of a public broadcasting approach. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, we weren't the first ones to start it, but there was this momentum building. I mean, the cuts have been brutal. Certainly not only us, but they've been particularly brutal. Some studies have shown we've had more cuts than other news groups. And so I think there was just kind of pressure. We had to speak out and do something. It's always awkward to talk about ourselves.
I know,
right?
It is. But generally,
Yeah.
let me ask you, John's explained who the new owner coming in, a deep pockets, a billionaire, and who is Digital First? They're a different kind of model, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're owned by a hedge fund out of New York, so it's definitely a different model.
The bottom line's a big deal to them,
Right.
maybe not so much to a billionaire.
We had one of those as well. Platinum Equity owned us for
Exactly
a while.
right.
The Copley
Yeah.
sold to them.
Yeah, so different from private ownership for all those years with the Copleys, and when I was there.
And we saw that same thing with Platinum Equity almost immediately on the day they took ownership there. They slashed 200 jobs.
Right. What's the response been to the Orange County Register and other papers pushing back and saying, hey, sell this, do something different, save our papers?
I mean, I know the Denver push, they've had some offers, it sounds like, from a group that was trying to raise money and potentially buy them. I haven't heard of anything that dramatic for us yet, and in terms of readers, it's a mixed bag. I mean, we have people that, have been loyal subscribers for a long time that are really supportive, but as you all know, the climate for media is not great right now. So, I mean, if you read the comments on some of those stories, it's brutal, with folks saying, you did this to yourselves, your newspapers are a dying breed, and, so it's that, and the fake news claims and things. So it's that difficulty of trying to make people understand why it's important while it's awkward to talk about your own business, So.
Right, and John, I did want to come back. You mentioned developer Doug Manchester owned the paper for a time here, but that was kind of a different approach. First of all, I don't think anybody puts him in the multi-billionaire class. He's a very rich man. Right. But he started the UTTV, a whole TV station that really didn't hardly go anywhere. And so that deep pockets guy didn't really work out, right?
Right, and where he spent his money was, as you said, it was on a TV station. And he was a local guy. There was some sense, since he was a local guy, bringing local ownership back to a newspaper is generally seen as a good thing. But he didn't really have either the deep understanding or appreciation of the role that newspapers play. He's a businessman, and he tended to think that way first.
And promote businesses and other things. Before we leave this topic, one last question for you. I know the sale's not quite final, but what might readers expect to see in terms of changes right away, or maybe not so much at all?
That's, we don't really know. That's one of the questions that remains to be seen when somebody come in, because you can talk a good game, but then what exactly is going to happen? He has promised on a number of occasions to invest in the newsrooms. He sent us a letter after the visit on Monday saying we're going to give you the resources you need to do the kind of journalism that San Diego needs. So we'll have to see what exactly that means.
Well, we'll certainly watch, and everybody can pick up the paper every day and see the changes and see what happens.
I hope they will.
I hope they will too. Our final segment today carries a touch of personal sadness. Our great friend and colleague, Kenny Goldberg, is retiring from KPBS after decades on the air here. And Kenny, you've covered the rich health beat in recent years, and I just want to talk generally, what's one of the main stories you've seen that has really occupied your time and changed and evolved over this time?
Well, I'd say the HIV/AIDS epidemic has absolutely been number one. I mean, and that's really transformed and been transformed since I've had the health beat almost 20 years. I mean, I was looking back at some of my notes, and in the mid-90s, HIV/AIDS was the leading cause of death for American men, 25 to 44. I had forgotten about that. It used to be just devastating. And now it's like a chronic disease like hypertension or diabetes that can be managed. So that's been an enormous change over the years.
And it was such an important story, and worldwide story. The station sent you to 3 different international AIDS HIV conferences, right?
That's right. I went to an international conference in Australia, in South Africa, and in Austria, International AIDS Society conferences. And there were just incredible discussions and workshops on different vaccine trials, on different drug trials, and it's a fascinating area.
And you were able to see some of the breakthroughs and how this evolved to being this kind of a life sentence back when to a treatable disease now.
That's right. And what we've also seen, since now it can be managed as a chronic illness, we've seen, unfortunately, a whole generation of young people that have grown up without the specter of people dying of AIDS or HIV, and therefore they haven't practiced safe sex, and so we've seen a resurgence of gonorrhea and syphilis, especially among men who have sex with other men. So there's been some dangerous trends in that regard.
And there was some politics involved in this way back when. The Reagan administration was criticized for a time for really not recognizing this, putting the research dollars for, but it's changed from this whole idea of a gay disease to this worldwide phenomenon.
Absolutely, and especially when we were in South Africa at the International AIDS Conference. I mean, it permeated every single element of society, and at the time, South Africa had one of the world's highest percentage of people that had HIV.
All right, and of course another huge story that you've written about more recently, and it's taken up a lot of time on your beat, is the Affordable Care Act. The Democrats took 13 months to push through the landmark legislation, 2009, 2010. How did it transform the medical system in this country?
Well, I mean, it's since the Affordable Care Act, the uninsured rate's been cut in half, more than in half in California and other parts of the United States, especially in the states that have embraced the Affordable Care Act and embraced the Medicaid expansion, which California did. And I don't think any state has embraced the Affordable Care Act more than California. We almost did our own Affordable Care Act when Schwarzenegger was governor, before Obama took power. So. But I think it's fostered some enormous changes, but at the same time, Republicans still attack it. They still use it as a political football. And I think they're still intent on destroying it by hook or by crook. Yeah,
it's interesting. We spent a lot of last year at the national level looking at news stories about Republicans' legislative push to get rid of Obamacare, as it's known, the Affordable Care Act, and it was close, but obviously it didn't happen.
No, but what they did do is in the new tax plan, they've got a poison pill in there which eliminates the individual mandate next year, and when that goes out, that'll be less incentive for healthy people, especially healthy young people, to get health insurance, and so that's going to goof up the markets, and therefore premiums will probably rise, and we're going to see this syndrome all over again.
And of course, we're in an election year, as we talk about all the time on this show, and this will certainly be an issue now as they go about to the various states. And it still is a patchwork across the country in terms of exchanges and how they work here and how they don't work there. Federal subsidies were taken in some places, not in others.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, earlier this year, Texas, and I think it was 17 other states, have sued the federal government, claiming now that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional because they took out the individual mandate. I'm not sure how that reasoning works, but that's what they're trying to do anyway.
Well, why did the Republicans fail in the end? It kind of comes back around to the grassroots, right?
Well, I think there's an adage, it's tough to take away a social program, once it's been instituted. And I think they found that when push came to shove, people are jumping up and down and pitchforks and so on and so forth about the oppressive Affordable Care Act. But when it comes down to it, people want to have their health insurance. They don't want to see it taken away. And I think Republicans were faced with that reality. They just couldn't deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we're going to see this again, as I say, play out through this political year, and who knows what's going to happen. In California, we've talked about a single payer here, kind of their own act. The Democrats put forth this bill, but no real funding mechanism.
No, and I think what they're trying to do now is do a sort of a piecemeal approach to get to universal coverage. There's a bill moving through the legislature that would give people here who are here illegally Medi-Cal coverage. Right now we offer that to the children of people who are here illegally. They're talking about expanding it to everybody in the state. So in a sort of a backwards way they're trying to get to a universal coverage thing in California without doing single payer.
All right, a few seconds left, but as we move on to the presidential election in 2020, it could be the maiden Democratic candidates in the primaries are going to say single-payer Medicare for all sort of thing.
I think so, and I think that's probably the way we're going to go eventually. Whether it'll happen, this next cycle or in 20 years, who knows? But I think that's the way it's going to go.
Yeah, so the political debate never really ends on this. We're going to continue to go through it.
No, unfortunately not.
You won't be here to cover it, but we will be with KPBS and certainly the Union-Tribune.
So what are you going to miss? What are you most going to miss?
I think the creative aspect of doing stories. I mean, starting out every day with a blank sheet of paper and a blank computer screen, you have to fill it up at the end of the day. I mean, that's a challenge of being a reporter, and that's also the fun of it.
Well, we're going to miss you, Kenny. It certainly is.
Thanks.
And we're out of time, unfortunately. It does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Brooke Staggs of the Orange County Register, Jane Heineman of KPBS News, John Wilkins of the San Diego Union-Tribune, and for the final time, Kenny Goldberg of KPBS. Not many know that Kenny was a touring musician before turning to journalism. We say goodbye now with the song Bon Voyage from Kenny Goldberg.